Good afternoon. My name is Kay Jacobson, the Online History and Current Events Coordinator of the Ramsey County Libraries. It is my pleasure to welcome you to Tuesday with the Scholar, and today we will be hearing from Boyce Holt. First, I just want to thank Osher Lifelong Learning Institute for providing us with this platform, and for the Ramsey County Libraries for providing us with funds for this talk. Now, Boyce Holt is a nature critic whose writing probes the relationship between humans and the rest of the natural world, especially in the U.S. South. Boyce grew up in the Connecticut suburbs and holds a bachelor's degree from Haverford College and a Master of Fine Arts from the Program of Writers at Warren Wilson College. He moved to the Mississippi Delta in 2009, where he discovered an unexpected wilderness amid an agricultural empire, the Mississippi River, which for hundreds of miles offers a corridor of islands and sandbars and wetland forests with no settlement or development. An obsession with how this wild place came to persist despite so much change and engineering inspired a wider interest in the strange nature of nature itself. This thing that we call separate but are really a part of, Boyce's work ranges from straightforward journalism and science writing to travel writing that invites readers to better connect with the more than human world. Boyce first came to my attention when I was reading a book review of his latest book, and I'm going to say this wrong, I just blanked. Is the Great River or the Big? It's the Great River, right?
Great River, yeah.
Which is the making and unmaking of the Mississippi River. And otherwise, I'm going to hand things over to Boyce. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Kay. I'm excited to be here. Let me see if I can get this shared. Okay. You guys can see my screen now. Hope so. Thank you for that introduction, Kay. Really excited. Looks like we have a really big group here. So this is really cool. And excited to be talking from the very bottom of this great watershed to folks spaced up at the top of the watershed. And I thought it'd be, as I was thinking about what to say today and how to get started, a specific anecdote came to mind that I wanted to begin with, which was when I sort of launched the reporting process for this book. So you can see the cover here on the screen. One of the things I decided I would have to do is explore as much of the watershed as I could. And so I picked out various sites along the Mississippi and its major tributaries where there were sort of debates or discussions going on about what we should do with the Mississippi River. In some cases, even, what is the Mississippi River? Because that's a complicated question. And one of the places that I identified was actually Minneapolis itself, for reasons that I will come back to in a little bit. But what I want to share now is when I went up there and explored Minneapolis and other parts of the upper river. Part of that trip, I was like, I would really like to see the river. And for me, seeing the river means getting out in a small vessel, usually a canoe, getting as close to that water as possible. So found an acquaintance, a friend of a friend that had a canoe and had used to work as a canoe guide. And we launched in Brooklyn Park and made our way down into downtown Minneapolis. Right. And so then, of course, that meant we were coming up upon Upper St. Anthony Falls, and that lock is closed. So our only option there was to portage around it. And this happened to be during the Stone Arch Festival. And so there's a lot of people on the shore there. And I remember as we were coming in, there was a woman kind of leaning over this railing, watching us come ashore. And when we got close enough, she leans down and she goes, "What river is this?" And so Michael, my canoe guide, we both chuckled and we told her it was the Mississippi River. And she was like, "Oh, yeah, that's what I thought." And that moment, it didn't make the book, but it really stuck with me because it was funny and it was an extreme example, but it kind of represents something that I noticed again and again and again throughout the reporting of this book, which is that to a surprising extent, people really don't seem to know the Mississippi River, right? So one of my the central idea that I figured I'd talk about today is that how the Mississippi River is at once perhaps the most famous river anywhere in the world, but at the same time has become a lost river, a river that it's hard for most people to visualize. And one of the things I've really come to believe through my work on this book is that if we want to have a living, vibrant, healthy Mississippi River, one of the things we're going to need to do is, and I say we, I hope I have other river lovers on this talk today, but the work before us is getting more people to know the Mississippi River and hopefully even love the Mississippi River. So um, I will also note, Kay just shared some of this, but I want to go back through this story a little bit. This idea of lostness in many ways has to do with how it is I came to write this book, The Great River. I grew up in suburban Connecticut, which, as you probably know, and you can definitely see on this map in front of you, Connecticut is not part of this big sprawling watershed. By sixth grade, I knew I wanted to be a writer, but back then, if you had told me, "Hey, yeah, it's gonna work, but your first book's gonna be about the Mississippi River," that would have been a big surprise to me, right? Because I'm sure that we learned something about the Mississippi in my history classes, but I have no recollection of what I was told about the Mississippi River, or even what I thought about it as a kid. I do know at some point along the way, I just sort of inherited a sense that the Mississippi must be basically a big, giant, toxic, industrialized navigation ditch, and not much more than that. And I held on to that sense for a long time. So you might be wondering, how is it that I then came to write this book? Basically, what happened is there's no straightforward path to being a writer. And I decided in college, maybe the one way I could make this happen is live an interesting life. And so I wandered around for a couple of years after college, lived on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota for a few years. And then eventually, as a 25-year-old, wound up getting a job at a nonprofit in a region that we call the Mississippi Delta, right? This is like the old Cotton Kingdom, the land where the blues began down there in the state of Mississippi. Really beautiful place. It's also sort of a deeply haunted place, a deeply American place in my mind. It's really bound up in the agricultural history of our country, the racial history of our country. And the strategy of mine wound up working. I was so fascinated and entranced by this landscape and the culture and the history of the Mississippi Delta that I sort of had to become a writer. And so I started writing essays and journalism. Some of it, at first, I just kind of self-published online, and then started writing for local magazines and worked my way up to bigger and bigger magazines. But for 6 years living in this region, as I'm starting to get a sort of foothold as a journalist, as a writer, I still don't think about the Mississippi River at all, because it's still not particularly relevant to my life, right? This region is literally named for the river, built by the river. The soils you see in this photo were dumped down by the Mississippi River flowing off the continent, but it's off behind a levee. You can spend your whole life here, and I know people that have spent their whole lives here and basically never see the Mississippi River at all. And then what happened was, as I'm making my way as a journalist, I get an assignment about a man named John Rusky, who is now a dear friend. John is sort of the canoe guide in the South on the Mississippi River, at least. And so he lived near me in Mississippi, and was just well known as the guy that took tourists out. He took Anthony Bourdain out on the Mississippi River. He went out with National Geographic. And so I convinced a magazine that intrigued me, because I was like, what is it like to take tourists out on this big industrial behemoth of a river? So I convinced a magazine to let me write about that, which meant spending 3 days and 3 nights with John out on the river, camping, hiking. And so this is what I found out there, right? I had this image that the Mississippi River is nothing but a ditch. And then I found the space that was just so, so beautiful. And I got really obsessed with that beauty. And I basically, the beginning of this book is that I looked for any excuse I could find to come back. So found more journalism assignments out there, but then also just started going for fun on weekends sometimes. In 2017, with John and a bunch of other people, canoed all the way from St. Louis down to the Gulf of Mexico. And so just kept digging and digging, asking questions, trying to understand, why this wilderness space that I didn't know about still existed, why I didn't know about it, right? It was crazy to me that for 6 years I had lived basically a dozen miles from one of the most beautiful places I could think of, and nobody had told me it was there. And that eventually grew into this book, again, that covers the whole of this watershed in many ways, that tries to tell the tale of what's been done to all of this water, and which I learned was deeply intertwined with so much of American history. So a couple things I will just share as we get started, like the basic learnings here, but that are good context for this. One is that my experiences out there on the big southern Mississippi River led me to conclude that you can't really understand the Mississippi River if you think of it only as a line that begins up where y'all are in Minnesota and comes down here to where I am in Louisiana, right? There's so much water pouring down. I'm actually 2 blocks from the river right now. So much water basically in my backyard, because this is a 1 million square mile watershed, actually 1.25 million square miles. There are more than 100,000 named waterways that pour into the Mississippi River. And that is part of what makes it the Great River, as I call it in the title of the book. The other kind of big point to make is that I have learned how chaotic the Mississippi River is. It's particularly true down here in the South. So I showed the cover image of the book before. It has a map very much like this one. It's drawn from the set of maps. These were created in the 1940s by a geologist named Harold Fisk, who worked for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which, as probably many of you know, is the federal agency that oversees work on the river. And we'll get back to them in a little bit. But what Fisk did in these maps is was sort of trying to trace in these colored lines where the Mississippi River down here in the South had wound over the past 1,000 years. And you can kind of, if you look at the landscape carefully, if you fly over the landscape, you can see sort of these scars carved into the earth by this river. And I love these maps because I think they do something really rare. In a static image, they manage to capture the fact that this river is wild and chaotic and ever changing. And I will also mention, again, there's going to be a lot about the Southern River today because that is where, in my mind, the Mississippi River becomes its true self. But you guys also live in a region that is marked by the chaotic nature of this river. You guys all know about St. Anthony Falls, I'm sure. Hopefully some of you know some of the geological history here. Basically 12,000 years ago, the falls were 10 miles downstream of where they are today. And why they have kind of retreated up to downtown Minneapolis is because of the geology that you can see in this image to the left. There are very soft layers of sandstone underneath a harder layer on top. And so the water pouring over this waterfall would sort of splash backwards and undercut that sandstone until that green stuff, the Platteville Formation there, would basically be like standing over nothing and would fall and collapse. And so gradually, bit by bit, the river retreats backwards. And that yielded what for a very long time? One, it yielded the only thing that you could possibly call anything like a canyon anywhere on the Mississippi River. So it's a very unique space on the river. But as late as 1805, when Zebulon Pike was the first sort of American explorer to go up and chart the river in y'all's territory, he noted that the entire 10-mile canyon was basically one long giant waterfall, these really chaotic rapids that were very difficult for him to navigate. And so, yeah, this chaotic nature, there's a lot of connections between the very northern stretches of the Mississippi and the southern stretches of the river. And one of them is that chaos. But coming back just briefly to this Fisk map for a moment, just to put it image back in your mind, I always like to show this image and then compare it with another one that appears in the map, which was also created by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, basically in the same era that Fisk map was created, but looks entirely different, right? Here, rather than emphasizing the wild nature of the river, you get a sense of control. And what we're seeing here is this schematic image of what's called the Project Design Flood. So on the lower river in the South, the federal government has created this very complicated system of flood protections. And the Project Design Flood is basically this hypothetical disaster that they have dreamed up, the Army Corps dreamed up, and said, this is basically the worst thing that we can see happening given the way historic weather has happened. And this map shows kind of how much water will come into this system because of those storms, and then where the Army Corps can store or move that water. And it just really strikes me as this sort of image that implies a deep sense of control over the river. It's like the river is sort of like a plumbing machine as much as a river in this image. And part of why I share this is one of the questions that I get a lot when I talk is what do you mean by making and unmaking of the Mississippi River? And this image shows part of what I mean by making, right? If we have decided the Mississippi River is something that we can control, as is shown in this image, we have sort of had to make all kinds of things to make that happen. You can see on the bottom half of this image, things labeled outlets and floodways, and it's spillways is abbreviated there, Bonnie Carey spill. They're gates for each of these that the Army Corps can kind of open and close when they know the river has hit certain stages and they want to move water into different places. And so that is one of the things we've made. Part of this flood control system, we've also made this huge system of levees. So there's 3,700 miles of federally controlled levees here in the South that are used to protect the farmland where I used to live. There are basically the banks of the river down here are entirely paved in concrete. And so this was from a low water year a couple of years ago. You can see that concrete is always getting battered by the river and they have to lay down more of these blocks, but that helps hold the river in place. So it's not changing anymore. There's even 14 man-made shortcuts on the river down here in the South between Memphis and the top of Louisiana. The idea here was straighten the river and make it flow faster. And it's basically going to flush the river, its floods out towards the Gulf of Mexico more quickly and sort of save the South from more flood damage. And this is a really, really substantial alteration, but it's an interesting one. It's often forgotten, not frequently talked about, because once it was done, it sort of becomes naturalized. You're out on the river and you just see river, and you don't realize the river used to sort of make these winding loops that it doesn't make anymore. And these have had a lot of sort of rippling consequences that were still, this was done in the 1930s. And even today, the river is still kind of adjusting to those changes in ways that have real effects. Down here in the South, we also have basically pinned the river in place. In Louisiana, the Mississippi, historically over thousands of years, would completely change its direction, right? The mouth of the river used to be 100 miles west of where it is right now, and it would just all of a sudden, in what's called an avulsion, alter its path. And so in the 1940s, the Army Corps of Engineers realized this looked like it was going to happen again in northern Louisiana. So they built this and many other structures at a site called Old River to kind of just keep the rivers in place, and only let a certain amount of water down this distributary called the Atchafalaya River that was threatening to become the major Mississippi. So as a way of talking about the scale of all this, I want to look at this image really briefly. This is a map of, again, the lower Mississippi River. We're going to get back to the upper in a second, I promise. But it's useful to see this. This shows you, so the lower Mississippi River begins at the bottom of Illinois and goes for 1,000 miles. And what you see shaded here is the floodplain of the river. So historically, before any engineering, anything that's shaded here would have every year or two received some kind of floodwaters, probably just a few feet, maybe even a few inches, but the river would wind up stretching as much as 90 miles across. And I want you to hold this image in your head as now I flip to this photograph taken from the International Space Station. And I just find the comparison of these two so striking, right? You can see it's as if that map of the floodplain has been literally scraped into the surface of the Earth, which in many ways it has. What you're seeing here is the levees were built that I just talked about, and that managed to keep the old floodplain dry. And so with the floodplain dry, what used to be this giant sprawling cypress oak tupelo forest all got cut down and got turned into what used to be cotton farms and what are now soybean and corn farms. And on those farms, right, the trees kind of block your image of the soils, but the farms don't. And so you're seeing the bare exposed soils of all these farms. And this is just an incredible swath of land that's completely changed. And this is where I get into what I think of as the unmaking of the river, right? What you're seeing here can be interpreted in many ways. You can look at that dirt and say that's a huge amount of wealth that has really powered the American economy. But you can also see that this is a sort of simplification of the landscape. This place that used to be filled with bears and panthers and ivory-billed woodpeckers and red wolves now is just a bunch of sort of monocultural stands of corn and soybeans, which is undeniably something has been lost, if only biodiversity, right? And so when I look at this image, I see a river being unmade. The old, wild, chaotic, ever-changing river has been unmade because we've made a river of our own, anew. And so again, to bring this into your context a little bit, the engineering is quite different on the upper Mississippi, and I'll come back to it, but you guys are lucky that you have been spared the impacts of levees to the same extent, because in 1924, thanks to the advocacy of the Isaac Walton League and Will Dilg and other allies, Congress created the Upper Mississippi National Wildlife Refuge, 240 miles of river from Rock Island in Illinois up to just below the Twin Cities, where levees were basically forbidden. And so you still have this intact floodplain, but of course, 6 years after this wildlife refuge was created, the very same Congress, I mean, a few different congressmen, but the same institution said, yeah, I know we made a wildlife refuge, but still we want to make sure that there's navigation on the upper Mississippi. And so 6 years after the wildlife refuge was started, the long process of constructing the locks and dams on the upper Mississippi came in. And to me, there's a deep relationship with this, right? The engineering is different in the North and the South. We're mostly levees. Y'all are mostly locks and dams. But the same sort of philosophical impulse is driving this idea that, like, we want to make this river useful, and to make it useful, we're going to take what we like about it and we're going to alter and simplify and get rid of the rest. And so engineering is put in. And the outcome is also the same. There's this unmaking of the old nature of what the river is. And so in particular, the effects of the navigation system on the upper Mississippi has had really substantial ecosystem effects. You see this large pool held back by, this is lock and dam number 7. So pool number 7, this is the entirety of the river used to look like the upper end of the map here, where you see these different channels and braided flows of water. Now we have these big pools, which is just, I mean, one, that the dams themselves can block fish, but these pools are simple habitat that aren't great for fish. And then more than that, in terms of the losses, the amount of sandbars and islands and marshes and forests that have been submerged due to these locks and dams is the same as the entire footprint of the city of Chicago going underwater. And at this point, the scientists that work for the federal government, kind of studying what's going on here, are not quite sure what we're going to be able to see in the future of this ecosystem, right? The silver maples that are a keystone of the riverside forests in this region are dying because of all this water, because of increased flooding. Invasive species are coming in that are much more tolerant of that water. And so we're at this inflection point that we've never seen before. And it's really hard to know what the river will look like in the coming years. So again, as much up there as down in my neck of the woods, there has been this making and unmaking. I do want to come back to this image one more time, though, because as I said, there's lots of ways to interpret this. The first thing my eye gets drawn to here is this sort of brown, bare dirt. But the other thing you can see are ribbons of green amidst that dirt. And what those ribbons of green are remaining forests that still exist along the Mississippi River, right? So you can see the Mississippi and also the White, the St. Francis, the Arkansas rivers have intact floodplain forests, because these rivers were so big that when the levees were built down here in the South, it would have been foolhardy to put them right up against the edge of the river. And so this space was left over. And that's the space I found early on in my travels on the Mississippi River, was the more than 2 million acres that remain undeveloped down here in the South, which is actually bigger than the National Wildlife Refuge that y'all have up in the North, which is a reminder to me, right? So I said making, unmaking. Interestingly, the way I'm using making and unmaking, they're obviously antonyms, but ultimately they're the same thing. Every time you make a new river, you unmake the old river. And so it's this complication of boundaries. And that's something I think about the Mississippi generally. It is a very, very, very engineered river, and yet it remains a very wild river, a wild feeling river, but in ways we'll get to later. It remains wild and out of our control. And so in a lot of ways, I have come to think of the river as a cyborg. It's not a word I use in the book, but in talking about the book lately, it's come up of you can't really decide which of these two categories to put it in. Is it natural? Is it synthetic? It's both of those things, as is so much of our world. And that is, I think, something that more people ought to know, right? It's something I didn't know growing up in Connecticut, because I didn't think about this river at all. It's something that woman who said, "What river is this?" couldn't possibly know. We sort of left the river behind. And so that's what I want to do with most of the rest of the time before the Q&A, is talk about what has been done on the river and why I think that has led to us losing sight of the Mississippi River. And then at the end, hopefully give us a little bit of hope of how we might refind it and what that might mean. So the finding and losing of the Mississippi. We're going to start with the finding. And we're going to start with this man, Hernando de Soto, that you see on horseback here, who in many official accounts would be labeled the official finder of the Mississippi River, right? So he is a Spanish conquistador who arrived in Florida in 1539 and spent the next couple of years kind of looping around the southeast of the U.S. On this wandering expedition with 700 men in his army, ransacking indigenous communities, getting in all these fights, losing half of his men, dying ultimately, but that's a different part of the story. This painting is titled The Discovery of the Mississippi by De Soto and hangs in the U.S. Capitol, which is a pretty official affirmation, again, that he is the guy, the discoverer. To add to that, his name appears all over the continent, right? So down here, I used to live near DeSoto County in Mississippi. I used to live near DeSoto Lake, which is near where maybe DeSoto came across the Mississippi River. Y'all have DeSoto, Wisconsin, up in your neck of the woods. His name's everywhere, which I find frustrating, because I find that the narrative that this is the guy who discovered the Mississippi River problematic for a couple of reasons. One of them is just simply, like, unlike later generations of explorers, people like Captain Cook, who explicitly thought of their mission as going out and sort of mapping and charting the world. That's not what Hernando de Soto was trying to do. He was just wandering around hoping he'd stumble upon some gold, and had made no real effort to make maps of anything he saw. And so there's a record, at least one surviving record from his army of the notes they took when they came upon the Mississippi River 3 years into their big wander across North America. I quote it in the book. I'm going to read a little bit here. They said, "A man standing on the shore could not be told whether he were a man or something else from the other side. The stream was swift and very deep. The water, always flowing turbidly, brought along from above many trees, driven onward by its force." And so, yeah, to me, as a writer, those sentences are frankly kind of boring. And it would be maybe inappropriate to expect DeSoto and his men to be really romantic about the Mississippi River, right? We're 200 years before William Wordsworth invents sort of romantic nature poetry. And that's so people don't just like sit there and look at rivers and write poems about it yet. But still, even it just doesn't sound like someone who has come across realized they've discovered something that is of world historical importance that they're going to go home and tell their buddies when they get back to Europe about. And it does not seem like they did, because it took 130 years after this expedition before anyone came back to the river. There's no map left behind by DeSoto's men. So that's part of it. Like, you can't really discover something if you're not looking for it. The other reason why I think it's problematic to say Hernando de Soto is the discoverer of the Mississippi River, though, is because you cannot really discover anything that that is already found. And I see there's things popping up in the chat box. I can't look at the chat box right now while I have the screen sharing. So if I need to be interrupted, Kay or someone, feel free to interrupt me. Otherwise, I'm going to move forward and come back to the chat at the end. But yeah, you can't discover something that's already known. And so this is a picture of the Winterville Mounds, north of Greenville, Mississippi. One of what I'm often called Indian mounds. I use the word earthworks in my book, or interchangeably. Mounds is okay too, but earthworks, I think, captures some of the grandeur of these. I'm sure y'all are familiar with the effigy mounds in Iowa, which are actually under threat because of rising floods lately, which is a story for another time. But these earthworks became really important to me and to the book. I'm only going to talk about them briefly today. And what I want to say about them basically hinges on the fact of how long people have been on this river. So I think of the Mississippi River that we know as being basically 12,000 years old, right? There are other ways to date that, and I go through some of that geology in the book. But I said before, St. Anthony Falls, I think I said this, it's 12,000 years old. 12,000 years ago is when it first formed, when it sat down near the mouth of the Minnesota River. And there's a reason why that 12,000 year date appears at the formation of St. Anthony Falls. That's basically when the last ice age ended. The glaciers began to retreat, and we settled into the modern hydrological regime that we have today. So that's also down here in the South when we kind of got the big meandering river that's on those colorful maps that appear on the cover of my book. And that 12,000 year date is important because the archaeology shows that people have lived on the Mississippi River for at least 12,000 years. So basically, the entire time the Mississippi has been the Mississippi as we know it today, it's been a river that people have lived alongside. And what I learned from studying these earthworks was that it seems that it was not just a river that people kind of lived alongside and saw and knew, but a river that they looked at with real reverence, right? That chaotic nature that I talked about earlier didn't seem, I mean, I think people were scared of that, and they had to find ways to accommodate that chaos, but they also saw advantages of how much life this chaotic, ever-changing river would bring, particularly down here in the South. I've come to believe that the mouth of the Mississippi River was maybe the most spiritually important place on the North American continent, if at the very least, the most important spiritual place in the watershed, where people, even up in your neck of the woods, did and may still do kind of tell stories about spiritual figures down here that helped bring life to the world, right? And so it's this sense of knowing the river as an entity, a being of its own, that I don't think Hernando de Soto or the European colonists and settlers who followed embraced. So I'm not sure that sort of white settler culture, for lack of a better term, ever fully knew the Mississippi River. And to underline that, I want to go back. I said after 130 years, or it took 130 years before another white explorer came to the Mississippi River. The next people to come were the French, and they were much closer to y'all's neck of the woods, coming from Montreal through the Great Lakes. And indeed, in 1680, the first French explorers had come north and documented St. Anthony Falls. 2 years later was when La Salle, of another French explorer, came down and got to the mouth of the river, the first European of any kind besides DeSoto's men to get down here. He planted this cross in the mud down here in Louisiana and declared all of this watershed is now a piece of France, right? And then he decided, I'm going to go back to France. So he went upstream, and he had come over kind of through the marshes, what is now Chicago, crossed back through the Great Lakes, went to Montreal, sailed to France and talked to the king, and decided, I want to come back to the mouth of that big river and make a colony. I think if we control this giant continental river, we're going to have some real control of this place. But he's like, that was a really long trip to get to the mouth, to cross through all these Great Lakes. Let's not do that. Let's sail in this time. We're going to come past Florida, past Cuba, and just go right to the mouth because we know where it is now. Only problem is when we went on that sailing expedition, he somehow sailed right past the mouth of the Mississippi River and wound up landing in Texas instead. And he wandered around for a while saying, where the heck is that river? Where did I leave it? I thought I had found it. He had all these colonists with him that got very frustrated with this process, eventually mutinied and killed him. And so it's this real story of failure, which to me is something that comes up again and again in the modern history of the Mississippi River of the past couple of years. These attempts gone awry. So what happened there? Why did La Salle fail to reach the mouth of the river? Interestingly, if you look at his sort of navigation notes from that expedition, it does appear that he knew where the mouth was. He had correctly calculated that location. He may even have gone ashore at the mouth of the river. And one potential theory is that in coming ashore, he looked around and saw something that looks like what you see in this image. So this is not the mouth of the river. This is a little bit west, but it typifies the landscape down here in Louisiana, where there isn't sort of one singular river anymore. The river is beginning to fork apart into all these different pathways. And there's nothing like this delta anywhere in Europe. And so I have come to think that potentially La Salle kind of looked at the landscape he saw and was like, well, this can't be the mouth of a river. This isn't what the mouth of a river looks like. He had only seen it coming downstream. He'd never seen it from the ocean. So got confused and confounded and left. And that, again, I think is the first of many instances where a culture that arrived from Europe was kind of imposing ideas from the smaller river landscapes of Europe onto this big river. So I think of city of New Orleans, where I'm sitting right now, where I own a home. It's a big pile of mud. It's always shifting. I don't know that it's the smartest place for us to have built a city, despite owning a home here. I think in some ways you could say the same about Minneapolis, right? It doesn't make sense to build a city atop this waterfall that, albeit very, very slowly, is sort of this ever-changing dynamic place. But we have built that, and that's kind of where we are, what we're stuck with now. So moving on from there, again, one of my ideas that I want to stick with is that these European cultures and then now American culture that starts after that maybe never fully knew the river in the way indigenous people did after thousands of years of interacting with it. Nonetheless, it is very clear that in American culture, we at least saw the river. We talked about it. We saw it. We interacted with it. This image shows what is called a flatboat. And these flatboats were a major mode of conveyance in the early 1800s. In 1803, the river becomes a fully American possession thanks to the Louisiana Purchase. And it really becomes the first American frontier. These pioneers are moving over the Appalachian Mountains, establishing farms in the Ohio watershed. And the only highway they have available to them is this river system. And so they float their goods downstream. This era, there's not, up in your territory is not yet pioneer land. It's more fur trading land. So we'll get to the north later. I do want to just linger in this moment briefly, though, because I think, Twain has so dominated our image of the river that we've sort of forgotten the pre-Twain, pre-steamboat culture of the river. But it is really important, and I think has shaped American culture in many ways. And so the thing about this life, the thing about this life was how hard it was. It was really difficult moving boats on the Mississippi River. Thomas Jefferson, in making the Louisiana Purchase, was kind of envisioning this gentlemanly landscape of farmers, and everyone is like sort of polite and neat and living on their own farms. But to make that happen, he needed this river, and this river led to a different sort of rough and tumble hardscrabble frontier. In 1808, there's a writer who documented this. He went to Natchez, which is in Mississippi, was basically the largest town besides New Orleans on the river, on the lower river at that point. And in Natchez, there was sort of this community right down on the riverbank of flop houses and saloons, places dangerous and sloppy and full of drunkenness. And so this writer went down there to kind of check out the scene, and he came across these two boatmen who were supposedly arguing over who got to sleep with a prostitute that night. And they were basically boasting back and forth. And one of them says, I'm half a man and I'm half an alligator. And the other guy tries to one-up him, and he says, well, I'm half a man, but half a horse. And then they get in this big fight. And those lines somehow get sort of instilled as almost cliche of this era that is repeated again and again in the early literature of America, to the point that by 1828, when Andrew Jackson is running for president for the second time, successfully on this instance, he has a campaign song that uses that image in the song itself as sort of projecting what it means to be an American man, right? To be an American man means you like shout and cuss and get fights. And I think in many ways, unfortunately, it's not my favorite part of sort of American maleness, but I think that remains a piece of American culture that persists to today. And it came off the Mississippi River. So wanted to share that. But part of the reason why it was so rough and tumble was, again, it was really hard to move those boats upstream. It was a lot of work. And so quickly people started thinking, okay, can we do something to fix this? And some savvy inventors came up with the steamboat, right? So the first steamboats are getting onto the river by the 18 teens. By 1823, we've got the first steamboat to reach St. Paul, Minnesota. So navigating the full extent of this waterway. The next year after that, 1824, is when the federal government settles this debate over who should control this big water system, right? So Louisiana had kind of tried to pass a law saying which boats could and could not travel on their waters in the state of Mississippi. And the Supreme Court basically said, no, you guys aren't allowed to do that because this river is our highway. It connects the states. Only the federal government can oversee this river. And that's a really important moment because once the river became sort of perpetual federal property, the federal government was also decided we probably should have some kind of agency that can do the work here. And they looked around, and the likeliest agency was something called the Army Corps of Engineers, right? So the origin of this group was back in the Revolutionary War. During that fight, the General Washington needed people that could build bridges and fortifications and realized that the pioneers weren't very good at that stuff. We just didn't have enough science and math training, basically. And so he brought in some people from France to do that. And when Jefferson was seated as president, he remembered that and was like, that worries me a little bit. You know, we're not at war right now, but we will be again. And so even in peacetime, and maybe it's smart to have some young men that are getting trained in trigonometry and other mathematics so that we are going to be prepared for this stuff. And so he establishes West Point in New York, and the Army Corps is sort of embedded in that. It's part of this training academy. And they've grown a little bit through the years. By 1824, it's just still just the small group of sort of, you know, the stodgy mathematical army guys, and they've spent some time exploring and things like that. And so when Congress sets aside $75,000 to survey the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, it winds up going to this Army Corps of Engineers. And they're also going to use some of that money to start doing what they call improvements on the Mississippi River, where like, we've got these steamboats going, let's make it safer for the steamboats. And so there are various pieces to that, but the biggest thing really was just taking out hazards in the river. And the biggest hazards were giant trees, right? Ancient trees that had lived in these old forests that had been here so long. They would fall in the river and boats would crash into them all the time. And so by the mid 1820s, the Army Corps has invented this thing called the snag boat, which is crazy. They would just like power up their steam engine and slam into the tops of these trees that are sticking out of the water to kind of shake them loose from the mud, take them onto these boats and chop them apart. And it sort of sounds small, but it's a very, very ambitious effort to reshape what these rivers looked like and made them much, much safer for traffic. And eventually the ambitions of the Army Corps, they said, we want to make sure we don't get more snags, as these trees were known. So they began to cut down trees on all the riverbanks, which had some rippling consequences, right? The trees were holding down these riverside soils. So you take them out, all of a sudden the river starts to erode those soils, and the river starts being even more chaotic than it was before. So I said earlier, failure is going to come up again and again. This is one of these instances where if you try and take something as wild and dynamic as the Mississippi River and kind of simplify it into what you want, you're often going to make a mistake and the river is going to reassert its chaos. And that really happened after these early years of navigation. Still, nonetheless, despite that chaos, the snag boats made real improvements, and the Mississippi River became sort of a really central part of America. The steamboats was a part of the expansion of America in a way that I actually think it became so important that paradoxically, the steamboats itself began to lead to the river's lostness. And so to explain what I mean by this, I want to jump ahead to 1846. And to a man named John Banford. And so Banford was this pioneer riverman. He'd grown up kind of working on these feeder boats that were on the river, and he was entrepreneurial. And so he eventually decided, hey, I'm going to spend 2 years kind of floating the entirety of the Mississippi River, making all these sketches. And then I'm going to retreat to a barn in Kentucky and take my sketches and compile them together into one massive painting. And it was this long horizontal scroll. He said it was like 3 miles long. That is one of many lies of the frontier era. I think it was like 1,000, 1,200 feet. Still a very, very long painting. And what he would do is he kind of had these two spools. So it'd be spooled up on, parts of it would be spooled up on each, and you would just see a piece of the image as you do here. And then you could unspool it off one of those spools and respool it on the other and move it along. And it sort of imitates the experience of standing on the edge of one of these steamboats and watching the river go past. And he would do this. His wife played the piano, and he'd have all these people in the theater, and he'd be telling these like stories about his experiences. So he turned this riverboat trip into sort of a traveling theater experience he could give to people. And I will say the image you see here is not Bamford's painting. Bamford's painting has been lost to history, but his was such a success that there were all these imitators. So this is one of the imitators that is now housed at the St. Louis Museum of Art, and they kind of always show a different piece of the panel. So whenever I'm in St. Louis, I like to stop by and see what they're showing, right? But yeah, that success, that started in 1846. It debuted in Louisville, Kentucky, which was a big river town. And then it did well enough there that people in New York and Boston said they wanted to house it. It even went to London, where Charles Dickens saw it and loved this experience, right? So this is traveling around, like broadcasting the story of this American waterway. And the thing that struck me in this history was the experience of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, right? Very famous writer of his day. And he had this idea in his head to write an epic poem about the swamps down here in Louisiana called Evangeline. It was going to be the story of the Cajun people and how they settled into Louisiana, the happy home down here. And he had never been to Louisiana, so he was trying to figure out how to write this. And then he sees this notice in the newspapers about Bamford's panorama coming to town. And so he wrote in his journal, "The river comes to me instead of my going to the river," which I just found this really rich quote when I was researching this era, because Evangeline was a big hit, a national sensation. I think it really colored the way people perceived the river down here. But Longfellow never came down here, right? He was basing this entirely on the stories he heard through the painting that he saw. And so it's this moment when, yes, the river remains really important to America, but it's become so important that it's starting to abstract into this symbol, this tale we tell, and we're layering symbols on top of symbols, right? And Longfellow also famously went on to write another Mississippi River poem, Hiawatha. So he turned this into sort of his shtick, his reason for fame. But right, 1846, as these paintings are going out, it is not as if the steamboats are gone, right? So we're starting to lose the river because it's becoming a symbol, but the steamboats themselves are still out there. And newspapers are writing about these epic races between these steamboats. In 1859, 13 years after that panorama, is when a man named Samuel Clemens becomes a steamboat captain, right? Sam Clemens is going to later become Mark Twain. And he writes about how in 1859, when he finally lived out his long dream of becoming a steamboat captain, he felt he had hit the pinnacle of American society. There's no more important job in this country. So clearly in 1859, the river remains this big cultural force. But what I think you have to notice is, if you look past sort of the gilt and splendor and all these newspaper headlines about these boat races, is that you can already see the writing on the wall when it comes to steamboats and in some ways the Mississippi River. So 30 years earlier, back in 1837, the federal government decided, we're going to start reducing our investments in all this snag pulling and river clearing. And then by 1848, this system of river transportation had hit its maximum extent. Basically, every tributary in that entire sprawling watershed that I showed you that possibly could be cleared of snags had been. So these boats were reaching as far as they could. And by this point, the nation had become so addicted to sort of progress and reaching new places that was unacceptable. It was sort of well, we can't just stop now that we've conquered this watershed. So people started taking the same technology that powered these steamboats, the steam engine, and they put it into railroads. And so by the 1840s, we were having the first railroad bridges crossing the Mississippi River. I should say this is not the actual first railroad bridge. That is another thing that is lost to history. You don't have images of it, but this is a representation, an early bridge down in Rock Island, Illinois. And to me, this moment when these bridges appear is this key moment in sort of the American psychogeography, because for several generations, pioneers had been thinking of the frontier as going west down the Ohio and then south down the Mississippi. And now all of a sudden it is just absolutely west, the line straight west. The river has gone back to being what it was for Hernando de Soto. It's just this obstacle that we have to get across as we're unfurling our nation westward. And this is also a moment where things in y'all's neck of the woods begins to change, because all those great forests in the northern watershed become the source of lumber for pioneers that are heading west. And so there's this push to get upriver too, to start sort of extracting trees from that forest. And so by the 1880s, we've got Sam Clemens, Mark Twain. To kind of bring us back up to speed, he was only a steamboat captain for 3 years, and then he stopped for the Civil War. He then wound up moving to my hometown of Hartford, Connecticut, interestingly. And so by the 1880s, he started thinking, hey, I want to write about that old experience of mine on those rivers. And he decided, I need to go back and do some research to do that. And so in 1882, he went back out on the Mississippi River for the first time in a long time. And he saw that the railroads had absolutely conquered steamboats, right? He basically saw, he chartered a boat, and while he was out there, he saw one other vessel. And he was like, that's insane to me. It used to be like anywhere you were on the Mississippi River, you saw a half dozen, a dozen different vessels. He went to the wharf in St. Louis, where he used to work all the time, and it was just completely moribund. And it was dismaying for him to see how this river had faded away. And so this book, he wrote Life on the Mississippi first, but then also The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, published in 1885, was really, again, another symbol layered on top of symbols. He was taking this river that was fading from our country's consciousness and trying to like put it back in front of everyone's faces. And so the book is deeply nostalgic. I think it's a thing we forget about today. The preface says it's set 40 to 50 years ago, right? And so he's taking that highlight of the river's era and yeah, bringing it back in front of everyone in a way that really succeeded, to the point that I think now all we think of when we think of the river in many ways is Huck Finn. We forget things that happened before. We forget things that happened after. Interestingly, Twain was not the only person kind of thinking about the Mississippi River in this era, despite its moribund nature. Despite the lack of traffic, the Army Corps is simultaneously sort of making this really ambitious effort to re-engineer things. So this image is from 1884. Lake Winnebagosh, up in, again, y'all's neck of the woods, was the first reservoir built on the Mississippi River, near the headwaters. The idea here was, let's have a way to store water so that we can slowly release it into the Mississippi River and make sure in St. Paul, which has always been the head of navigation, that we can kind of get the water depth we need. And they found they could add 6 inches of water to St. Paul because of this and a couple other dams and reservoirs that were built in this era. 1885, the next year after Lake Winnebagosh, we've got the Davis Island Lock and Dam on the Ohio River. So this experiment to see, can you make a river as big as the Ohio hold back the water to keep it deep enough for steamboat traffic all year? And that worked. And that was sort of the first step towards building the navigation system that is on so many different tributaries today that we'll come back to. And so you might be wondering, right, when Twain saw this empty river and now there's all this construction, what's going on? Several things, one of which is the railroads are almost too successful and they're now a monopoly, and people are frustrated how expensive rail traffic is. And so they're like, maybe if we get the river back and build a better navigation system, we can bring down rail prices. But it's also a post-Civil War thing, and this idea of, we want to reunite the nation by building stuff. It's very much like the Build America Back stuff that we talk about today, right? So there's just this wave of investment despite and because of the lack of traffic out there. And the other thing that happens in this era, importantly down here in the South, is this system of levees starts to be built, right? The federal government does not get involved in this until the 1880s. At first, they're claiming that they're doing it also as a navigation thing of like, oh, these kind of help contain the water. But really, they're incentivizing large landowners down here in the South to be able to make money on farms. And this to me is very key to the losing of the Mississippi River, because literally down where I used to live, you cannot see the river anymore. And as these levees come up, as railroads replace the steamboats, the society in the South that used to be right on the riverbanks, it sort of retracts inwards and allows people to turn their backs from the river. And I know people that have lived here for multiple generations that have no relationship with the river because this 30, 40-foot tall levee blocks things away, right? So just again, to summarize the losing of the river through all this, I think one, it starts with the steamboats as those, with the railroads as those steal away steamboat traffic. This levee adds to it. But the last thing is this continued effort to sort of re-industrialize and bring navigation to the river also contributes to this. And so the efforts keep going despite the lack of traffic. I wanted to show this because the Meeker Island Lock and Dam was the first lock in Minneapolis, built in 1907, an effort, again, to conquer that very treacherous stretch of rapids. There had been other sort of efforts to blast open paths, but in 1907, the idea was like, let's do something more technological and help boats get up and down through this canyon in Minneapolis, right? And still, navigation is working on local scales like in Minneapolis, but it's not until the First World War that navigation really begins to succeed again and becomes the vibrant industry we have today. And so by 1910, I believe, 1920, in those early decades is when the Ohio was fully engineered into a navigation system. And then from 1930 to 1940, that system was extended to the upper Mississippi. And so we got the locks and dams that we're so familiar with today. And I will say, again, I think this has also contributed to the disappearing of the Mississippi River in multiple ways. So one of those is going back to this Meeker Island Lock and Dam. You can see how, hang on, sorry. getting lost in my narration here. Yeah, let me stay here for a second and say this was built from 1930 to 1940 is when the system was finished. And I want to keep some Minneapolis for y'all. So what happened at the tail end of that in 1939, this Meeker Island Lock and Dam was not quite enough for people in Minneapolis, right? The system that I'm showing here was built to go to St. Paul, was always considered the head of navigation. But people in Minneapolis were starting to get jealous and saying, well, we want to be part of this big river system too. So in 1939, just as this system of locks and dams on the rest of the upper Mississippi is nearly completed, a plan is passed to build a system of locks and dams in Minneapolis itself. And I will say this was a very complicated thing, a very hard project to conceive of because that canyon that I talked about is so narrow that there's nowhere very good for boats to unload. And so eventually the city was like, well, we're going to have to put our harbor above St. Anthony Falls, where kind of the canyon ends and the river spreads out in this more prairie ecosystem. And that meant that a lock had to be installed to get boats past St. Anthony Falls, which was always going to be a flaw in the system that we'll come back to, because you can see that that lock is pretty small compared to the big lock you can see in this picture. So a lock like this can fit maybe a towboat can push 15 barges into that lock. At St. Anthony Falls, they could fit 2. And so it was just not really tenable for a lot of the boats to go through this system. So we'll come back to that topic, right? This is an example of sort of our ambitions of controlling this river going almost too far. But the other thing I wanted to say about the navigation system is it leads to the losing of the river in new ways. And so one of those is literally losing the texture of the river. So this is a photo of, again, Meeker Island Lock and Dam today. And it shows that the river, right, this lock has been entirely swallowed because the river has been deepened by these new dams that were installed between 1939 and 1963 when the whole project was built in Minneapolis. And so, and this is true in other parts of the river too, right? The river used to look different, but as we build these dams, we lose its texture. But the other way that I think this navigation system led to the losing of the Mississippi River is whatever sort of romantic dream Huck Finn instilled in Americans of thinking about this floating down the river voyage, which is something I've done. I floated from St. Louis to the Gulf of Mexico back in 2017. It is, I can tell you from experience, often unpleasant and sometimes dangerous because the scale of navigation work, right? The locks and dams themselves can be frustrating. I have only had to pass through them a few times, but just the presence of the boats themselves can be quite scary. And so just in terms of figures, I think it's something like 30 to 50 people float the full Mississippi River every year. So it's not like no one does it. But by point of reference, the Appalachian Trail, there are 3,000 through hikes launched every year. And so it's orders of magnitudes different. And so the fact that the river has become so industrial, so dominated by this navigation industry, I also think has sort of pushed people away from a river that they might otherwise want to experience. To the point where we get to images like this. So this is a screen grab from the Wall Street Journal's review of my book. And I don't want to sound ungrateful. I am like so deeply appreciative that the Wall Street Journal reviewed my book. It was very clear. I got to see some pre-sale numbers. Like this review pushed a lot of books. It was a very thoughtful, a very kind review. The reviewer really understood what I was saying about the Mississippi River and how it remains a still wild thing. The only thing that frustrated me about this review was this image, which I really hate. It is a picture. This is the Chain of Rocks Canal, which is an 8.4 mile long man-made canal above St. Louis that allows boats to bypass a very shallow, rocky stretch near St. Louis. And it is the only place anywhere on the Mississippi that looks like this, but that means it is the only place anywhere on the Mississippi River that sort of confirms the common stereotype that a lot of us have received, because we don't go out on the river and we only hear these tales of engineering. I think this is what I used to think it looked like. And so someone at the Wall Street Journal was like, let's give the people what they want, and just slapped this image on there, kind of completely undercutting what I'm trying to argue for in this book, that the Mississippi River remains this big, wild, dynamic thing. So to close us out and get us towards some Q&A, I want to address one last thing, which might be, at this point, you might be wondering, who cares, right? Maybe this matters to someone like you that like loves the Mississippi River and wants to paddle out there, but does it really matter that the nation has forgotten about its big river? And I think it really does. And I think it does for several reasons. But one of the important ones, I think that story of failure that has happened again and again because of our misunderstanding of the Mississippi River is not over in my mind. Anyone who lives anywhere in the big sprawling watershed at this point, I think it can tell you a story about flooding. I'm sure that y'all have some tales of flooding. Interestingly, the past 3 years down here in Louisiana and other places have been low water years. And so that's an issue too. But really, the modeling that I have looked at has convinced me that we are going to have to continue to think about flood issues in the years to come. One of the studies that I found most compelling about this, it was really ingenious. It published back in 2018. Basically, these scientists said, we have 200 years of written records of floods on the Mississippi River, but it's important to understand these floods on an even longer scale. And so they said, how can we go back and see that? Oh, why don't we look at trees, right? Trees grow a little bit differently in flood years if they get swamped by water. So if we can find an old tree and look at the tree rings, that will give us some intel. So they went and found these old, I think, oak trees in the floodplain of Missouri and took out cores and got to see some of the flood history in that. And then they went and looked at soil cores from some of the floodplain, and they could see the flood will lay down a different amount of dirt in those big years. And so with that information, they created a rough calendar of 500 years of floods. And looking at that, they realized the past 100 years the flooding has gotten more intense and more frequent. And they were trying to figure out why. And there's various reasons. Climate change might come to mind as one of them. But they actually, looking at their models, they said they think 75% of that increase in floods, at least on the middle Mississippi where they were looking, was due to the engineering that we built, right? So basically we put all this stuff in the river, it's cluttering it up, kind of like plaque in an artery, squeezing things, and the water has nowhere else to go. And if you add in climate change, which is going to create bigger rain bombs, you add in land use all over the Mississippi watershed, where if you pave dirt, it no longer, like dirt is like a sponge. It's going to hold water and slowly release it into the river system. We're losing our dirt. And even in places, farm fields have these underground tiles that send dirt into rivers faster. So we've made all these changes that are making rivers bigger and bigger and bigger, to the point where I do worry down here in the South, in particular, this federal system we have for 80 years have never breached any levees. I am not convinced that if we don't make changes, that will not be true in the future. And so this connects with my big idea of sort of knowing the Mississippi River, because again, the mistake that I think we've made again and again and again is not sort of accepting the fact that the Mississippi River is big and chaotic and needs its own. And I think that if you get out and experience the landscapes that I've experienced, if more Americans can conceive of this river as an entity in and of itself, that may be an easier concept for more people to grasp. So I do hope that through my work, through reading this book, through talking to people, I can convince more people to spend time out on this Mississippi River. And so to close us out, I actually am going to bring us back to Minneapolis, because I think you guys are a potential point of hope in all this. I mentioned at the beginning of this whole talk, I had identified these places where there are conflicts and went to check out those conflicts. And the conflict I came to think about in Minneapolis had to do with Upper St. Anthony Falls, and had to do with the fact that maybe we can bring back that old rapid-filled canyon in the city, right? And I had told you guys earlier that this project was, I think, kind of foolhardy from the beginning, not very effective. And that proved to be true, right? By the 1990s, 30 years after this thing was installed, the city of Minneapolis was realizing the harbor was getting so little traffic that they were going to stop investing in any improvements. By the 2010s, the figures show that 2 boats each day were passing through this lock. Each of those boats had 2 barges, and they were mostly carrying gravel, sometimes scrap metal, so not particularly high-value cargo, right? And so the Army Corps of Engineers in 2015 knew that this lock was up for repairs, and they looked at those figures and they kind of said, I don't know, does it really make sense for us to spend a lot of money fixing up this thing if 2 boats are coming through every day? And so ultimately they decided, no, we're not going to spend the money to fix this. To me, that seems like a fairly straightforward decision. But when I was sort of reading about it, thinking about it, talking to people about it, I was really struck in reading the legal language used, right? Congress had to authorize, they had to officially deauthorize this lock. And the language that deauthorized the lock very explicitly said that the situation in Minneapolis was, quote, unique and not precedent setting. And then I found some other language really, really striking. There's something about, if you're evaluating whether or not a lock is useful anymore, that, quote, tonnage is an arbitrary metric, right? So that means a lock, which as I understand it is designed to move cargo through the river, if you're evaluating it, it doesn't matter how much cargo is moving through, which I understand there's probably a nuanced argument there, but it seems somewhat silly to me. It seems like a very strained statement. So why are those words in the law deauthorizing this lock? They seem pretty clearly to me to come from lobbyists from the navigation industry that were really pushing to make sure, right, this is the historic occasion, the first closing of any lock on the Mississippi River. And they were kind of wanting to make sure nobody gets any funny ideas from that, right? And part of what was at stake was the other dams in Minneapolis. This lock could never come out because this geological situation around the waterfall at this point is so precarious that you just kind of can't touch anything there. But now that this lock is closed, there are two others, I think. You guys probably know better than me, but the other locks and dams in the city, right, they're not serving that much of a purpose. There's no boats traveling the length of the city. And so there's a viable economic argument. Potentially those locks could be closed. And in that case, you could take out the dams entirely and you regain a lot of things, right? It is an unmaking of what we've made in this small instance. But some of the things that you'd get would be those rapids come back potentially almost immediately. If you get back those rapids, you have habitat for as many as a dozen threatened species. A lot of those are mussel species that kind of need that low flowing river. One back of the envelope calculation from an economist looked at this and said, I think $1 billion could come into the city of Minneapolis if we got these old rapids back from sightseers, but also from tubers, kayakers coming. I really think Minneapolis could very quickly become sort of this mecca for paddlers wanting to go and have a whitewater experience in an urban city. You get fly fishing in the city, right? You get this diversity of river users all of a sudden. And I think part of what was going on when Upper St. Anthony was lock and dam was closed was like that is nervous making for people who depend on this river for navigation. And so I'm just going to read a couple of lines from the book describing the way I've come to think of this. Sometimes it feels like the navigation industry wants to ensure there are no steps back. They'll find a reason to keep even the most useless infrastructure. Perhaps they worry if one dam comes out, people might like the resulting river. That glance at the original river might give people a chance to envision a future when the whole of the old Mississippi might return, right? And so I will note, and we might take this up in the Q&A if people have questions about it. It's complicated. It's not a straightforward thing to do. There are real questions about sort of what is in the mud behind those dams. Are there toxic things in that sediment? If you take out those dams, where do those toxic sediments go? So it is a complicated decision that has to be made, but I find myself quite excited by the idea of taking out those dams and bringing back this old river, unmaking what we've made. There's some precedent of this here in this what you see in this image. I don't know if you guys know how rare what has happened in Minneapolis is, but right, like this used to be a very derelict Skid Row area, and then between restaurants coming, the national park creating a national recreational river, the opening of the Stone Arch pedestrian walkway in 1994, this place is really transformed. I've been to Owamni a couple times there. I'm really inspired by sort of the indigenous involvement, all this. So there's a lot of hope already coming out of Minneapolis. I see this as a site that could be our step towards kind of inviting people back to that old river, rekindling our relationship with the wild Mississippi, and stepping us towards a better relationship with the totality of the river on the whole watershed. So I am going to stop there and now open it up to questions.
Okay, so since we just were speaking about Minneapolis and the St. Anthony Falls area, we have a question from someone. It's like, did you know there's a group of people looking at reimagining the St. Anthony Falls area to make it more natural and wild, and the Native American people are the main drivers in this group? And I found an article in the Minnesota Daily from and I posted this in chat. So everyone can go to this link, click it, save it to your device. I can also email this out. But this is from July of 2024. And it's approximately 5 acres of land near St. Anthony Falls in Minneapolis will go back to the Dakota community with plans to restore its significance to the area's 4 tribes. It's a nonprofit organization formerly known as the Friends of the Falls. It's in the Dakota language, so I can't speak that yet. And they've selected Seattle-based GGN to work with the Dakota Knowledge Keepers as the lead design team. And they've recently signed a 25-year lease with the Army Corps of Engineers for site control, allowing design and engineering process to begin. So it's looks like a fascinating article. I didn't get all the way through it, but I happened to find that. And that's an interesting thing, thinking that the Army Corps of Engineers is leasing this to them, and it's just very recent. So it sounds like they are moving ahead with,
Yeah, there's some really exciting work. Yeah, it was. I thought at one point all of that would be a major component of the book, and that's what I was up in Minneapolis working on. One of the
Mhm.
hard things in writing the book was my editor made me cut the last. There were three sections of the book: some old history, sort of American history, and then what is going on now. And I had to cut that last section in half. So I hope I get to write for a magazine at some point about what's happening up in Minneapolis. But those of you who don't know about it, I'd really encourage you to read about it because it's such an exciting project. And yeah, that indigenous involvement is really huge in my mind.
Mhm. So, and another person's wondering, if we remove locks and dams, won't invasive species like carp find their way north of the cities and therefore affect the ecosystem further up the river or the ecosystem, whichever? Um,
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that is one of, interestingly, that was one of the rationales for closing Upper St. Anthony Falls, right? Was saying if we leave this open, it becomes sort of a last passageway for invasive Asian carp to get into the headwaters region. I think the closure of that lock is part of the answer to that. Like, yes, I can't remember. It's been a while since I've checked sort of their progress northward. So I can't remember how close they are to Minneapolis. But yeah, I think if you shut down the system of locks and dams, it could mean further spread of Asian carp. It is sort of one of these when you get into the ecosystem issues on the upper Mississippi, on any of the tributaries, we are in sort of we face conundrums of like we've created an ecosystem that is entirely novel. It looks like no river in the past, and so we can't kind of go back to what we used to have entirely. And it is up to us to make these decisions of like, is it worth having carp spread, but also getting back a narrower, smaller river that allow sturgeon to spread or other species that have also been stopped by these locks. And so there are real trade-offs to anything we do. It's I'm not very good at solutions, particularly in this book, because sort of like I've been able to diagnose all these problems. And that's part of why the only solution really that often comfortable giving is like, just go out there and experience this river. The more people we have that have the relationship, then we can have real robust discussions of what is the best future for the river.
right. And it's like if we don't have these discussions, we don't discover these groups that are working to preserve the things. So that's why you need to have the awareness. So,
Yes.
okay. And now did you visit the headwaters when you were researching the book?
I did visit the headwaters. Yeah. There's a little bit note of this in the book of it took me a little while to do it. I sort of delayed it in part because as I said briefly at the beginning of that talk, right? I have come to think of the Mississippi River as being not just one line of water, but this whole tangle of water. And I think even the name Itasca itself is sort of complicated for me. I used to think before I knew anything about the river, it sounds kind of like, oh, that must be one of those names like Minnesota that comes from indigenous people. But no, this is Henry Schoolcraft made up that word by taking these different Latin words and it kind of means true head. And so he's sort of saying, this is the true head of the river. And I'm like, there is no true head of the river. There is no singular headwaters. But I felt like for this book, I had to, like this is sort of officially considered the headwaters. I should go see it. And I got to say, I found it so moving when I was there. It's such a beautiful park, as I'm sure many of you all know. But it was also moving to me to see, like, I have this thing of like I have to immerse myself in water, so I made sure I sort of laid down in this tiny creek that's beginning in the Mississippi. But I saw all these other families that had made this long trek, hours drive up to the middle of nowhere in northern Minnesota to see this place, and I was like, oh, means so much to me that people will take their vacation time and come up here and see where this water begins. What I always say though is like I think that basically anywhere across the million plus square miles of the Mississippi River watershed is a headwaters. If the rain falls on that watershed, it's making its way down to this river right behind my house. And so I wish we had the same reverence for every headwaters and said, anywhere you are is the headwaters of the river. Reflect on that, appreciate the like precarity and the importance of the place you are.
Yeah, I think of the argument for how much, like, considering the Missouri a tributary is actually almost as long, if not longer, than the actual from headwaters
Yes.
down to the
I
mouth, and
talked a
how
little
much
bit in
you
the
need
book.
to.
There was a document in the 1890s when I think the 18 no, yeah, around the 1890s, I think when Itasca became sort of officially a state park, the official headwaters of the river, and the author Jacob Brower did his best to kind of dismiss that, but it's a very specious argument. He's going like nobody ever has thought of the Missouri as being the headwaters, so we won't deal with that, and kind of sets it aside. It's funny to read that.
Yeah, because I think the Missouri is definitely a huge part of this, and it gets so overlooked, almost more lost than the Mississippi in terms of its importance too. Okay, but I know you have to have some focus.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and that was part of the trouble of that last section of the book. I actually went. The Missouri was also on my list of places I went. I went to Kansas City. I went other places, and that's a big part of the end of the book too. There are different but very important ecological fights happening on that river as well because of it has its own story of engineering. So.
Yeah. So someone, okay, just a quick little one here. They believe Abraham Lincoln worked on the river in a flatboat. Do you know anything about that or have a story?
I don't have an extended story. It's something that that is true. He definitely worked on a flatboat. He was representative of this era, right? I guess what I can say about it is I told you guys about sort of the rough and tumble boatmen of the early 1800s. 1808 was when that happened. I can't remember quite when Lincoln would have done it. It would have been several decades later. The river kind of tamed after a little bit, right? They got rid of those worst elements, and so Lincoln was part of this generation of sort of politer farm boys that came down. And in my research of that era, I noted not from Lincoln himself, but from other people of that era, they kind of were very aware of what used to happen on the river, and they would like in their journals, right, like conjure these tales of the old Mississippi and like hearing the wolves howling, or they would howl back and forth from their boats as if they were wolves and embracing this mystique of the Mississippi River. But there was one journal writer I came across through a historical journal entry. And he was doing that and talking about his wild experience. And they got to Memphis and he's like, I'm going to get a hotel room. It's a little bit much for me out here. I will say Lincoln famously kind of, at least the stories go, that the scar that he had on his face was gotten in some sort of dispute on the lower river on one of those trips where I think people were trying to steal his slaves. I don't remember the details of it all, but it was part of his own mythology, and why he became so opposed to slavery was partially because of the horrors that he claimed to have seen on those trips down there. And he's an interesting figure. He spans a lot of different eras on the Mississippi. He was part of the militia fighting against Black Hawk in the 1830s, which is a big era of transition on the upper river and the loss of indigenous culture there. And then later in the 1850s, Lincoln was actually the lawyer in a case where steamboat captains were fighting against the railroads that were starting to build bridges over the river, and sort of turned his back on the river and was representing the railroads and said, like, we need to, like, America is moving onward. So I quote that as well in one of the chapters.
Okay, so any thoughts on how the watershed might evolve in, say, the next 100, 200 years? I mean, this is, this person goes 1,000 years even, but
Sure.
just what actions we might be taking, and just if we didn't take, I mean, because there's two paths that you could go here in terms of how it could evolve. One, starting to take care of it, not over engineering it, or yeah, it's interesting thought.
Yes, it is an interesting thought. I have an easier time over the decadal scale rather than like centuries or millennia. And again, I looked there, it's sort of surprising how unrobust the studies of climate impacts on the river are, particularly down in my stretch. But the few studies that are out there really do show that in the next few decades, sort of the levee system as it stands today will not be tall enough to contain floods. And that's both because of sort of increase in water flows, but also, I mentioned this very briefly, but those cutoffs that were made sort of changed the river bottom in various ways. And so there's basically these big piles of mud that are drifting along the river bottom. And those are going to pile up near New Orleans eventually, where I live. And that will like sort of exacerbate flooding down here if we don't do anything about it. Other models show that I mentioned again briefly this old river control structure that kind of keeps the arrangement of rivers in Louisiana in place. The river continues to carve a better path for itself to the west of the river here. And so our engineering is very precarious. When you get to these sort of centuries and millennial scale, my sense is at some point, well, I mean, I hope it's not sort of like societal collapse, but I do think we'll get to a point where we're sort of the cost of upkeep becomes so onerous that we start to say maybe we should put some of these things back. And the river has been so dynamic for so long. Eventually, it's going to shift paths down here in Louisiana. Eventually it's going to smash its way through some of those locks and dams, and get back some of its old wildness. It will be a really different river because we'll have different species. There's new mussels, there's Asian carp, but I do think one way or another it's going to get wild, and so hopefully we can find a way to sort of gently facilitate that wildness instead of a disaster bringing that upon us.
Yeah, one thing I've been wondering, I know how different things were this year with flooding because of just the change. Like, we didn't have tons of snow, but we had so much rain over a prolonged period of time, spring into early summer, that our flooding really changed this year compared to previous years. And that's up north. What was it like down south this past year?
This has been interestingly, like I had the editor of this book grew up in Minneapolis, and he was up there this spring, I think. Whenever, I mean, he sent me a picture of Minnehaha and just the torrent of water coming out of it. And
Mhm.
it was amazing to see because down here in Louisiana, we were in our third year in a row of low water years, so low water that there were concerns about riverboat navigation, even concerns. We get our drinking water out of the river here, and if the river drops too low, sort of salt water creeps in from the Gulf and taints our pipes, and that these were issues, right? So that's part of the scale of the system of those kinds of floods that y'all had up north are going to be more frequent because of climate change, right? It just means a warmer atmosphere holds more water, and then it's going to release that water in these big rain bombs. And so, in scattered places, in like smaller river systems, you're going to get more extreme flooding. But the river system at large is so big that even massive flooding in Minnesota can be low water down here at the same time. And so it's sort of this dynamic of what's going on in the whole system. Down here, we worry about the years where you have storm systems kind of all over the watershed. And I do think, again, we've not had that since basically I started writing this book. I started in 2019 was the last really big flood year, but I think it probably will happen again in the next few years.
Yeah, and see, that's something that we don't even conceive of. We think, oh, if it's flooding here, it has to be flooding down
Yes.
there.
Yeah.
But
Like
that's not.
93 is the big northern flood, right? 93 meant nothing in the lower river. And still 1927 was our big flood down here, which I do think impacted things in Minnesota, but it was not, right? It's not the famous disaster up there because what made 1927 so bad here was that it was bad everywhere. So yeah, thinking like a watershed, it's important to study and understand these interconnections.
Yeah, and like you were saying, how you're just how many miles from the Mississippi right now? 5, 6?
A quarter mile at most,
Quarter
right? But
mile. Oh, okay, so you're really close.
blocks. Yeah.
Okay, so like I grew up like less than a mile from the Mississippi, and I'm thinking back and I'm like going, did I hang out on the Mississippi as a kid? No. And it was right there, and there's parks right there. And I just grew up north of Minneapolis, and I'm just like, how it gets overlooked. And it's like, there I am next to one of what we consider a great waterway, and how aware of that was I as a kid? I wasn't.
Right.
And just bringing awareness to remembering that it's kind of like we're not that far from these things, and we need to go out and take care of it.
Yeah, and again, I want to emphasize how lucky. I mean, it's not just like that. That Sonar's Bridge is a beautiful, beautiful park, and there's that what is it, Nicollet Island, right? Did you have incredible access to that site? But in general, I mean, I hope that y'all as Minnesotans are so proud of your park systems. Like the Twin Cities region has such great access. So yes, I'm 2 blocks from the river here, but if I walk 2 blocks from my house, there's a brick wall and there's a port in the way, and I have to drive 15 minutes to get to see the river anywhere. And so again, I hope you appreciate being where you are, the access that you have. So even if you are 5, 6 miles from the river, you have kinds of access that not everyone has. There's not a single public boat ramp in the city of New Orleans. So yeah, we have all kind of moved away from the river, but it will be easier for people in your neck of the woods to get back to it.
So, okay, last call for questions here, people, because we've gone through everyone that we had. Because you dealt with one which was DeSoto discovering the the Mississippi when it's like,
I saw that. Yes. Yeah. I'm glad that other people pick up on the fact that he is not a very legitimate discoverer. So,
yeah, it's just making people making other people aware that it's there versus the fact that thousands and thousands of people knew about it before that. So, um, otherwise, it's been anything else you want to share about before we like some
I
story?
no, I don't think so. I hope like if you enjoyed it. Again, I saw a note of there. I always wind up picking up steam and talking too fast, so apologize. I hope I didn't lose anyone with that. But if you enjoyed the talk, I hope you'll pick up a copy of the book. It should be available many bookstores in the area. You can follow me at boyceholt.com is my website, and that will lead you to social media and stuff. My email address is on there, so if people have questions, they want to come straight to me. I always love to hear directly from readers. Yeah, happy to connect with folks. So.
Library owns several copies that are always checked out. So,
Great.
this has been recorded. It will go up on the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at UMN on YouTube, and then also make it onto the library's website so people can go back and view. And I just said, use closed captioning because to the person who was saying you're talking too fast, I turned that on and it did a really good job of
Yeah.
um,
Keep
getting
moving
all of
forward.
that.
Learn to slow down one day. So.
It's good. Yeah, if you had, it would just be going on 2 right now. Okay. But no, it's been great. I'm so glad that I got you as a speaker. It's just been really entertaining and, so many things that I'm like going, awareness of things. So I'm glad that minnesotadaily.com, article looks really interesting. I just, like, read the first couple articles when I pulled that up. And, yeah, I wanna also thank our tech person, Grayson Simmons from the Ollie, and he's done a great job of keeping us moving along here, doing the recording and everything. We also thank once again Ollie and the libraries for providing this platform and the funding for this talk. And we definitely want to thank all of you for showing up. And oh, 2 more questions. See, I knew if I talk loud enough. Oh, just thanks. Everyone's like fascinating. Thank you. Great topic.
Glad to hear
So
it. Yeah.
really glad that you are here, and yeah, maybe keep writing, and maybe we'll have you back sometime. It'd be
Yeah. I'll find a way. So thanks, y'all. Appreciate
yep.
it.
Thanks, everyone.